First story. To understand my story, you sort of have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws in our country, and that we don't have any, so long as you're respectful and non-destructive. You can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing so long as once you leave the area is how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There are always yachts bobbing just off the shore with people in them and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this was the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in winter 2010, after picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift from me to me, as I paid her adoption fee. Reddit. I know you love dogs and she'll be very important to the story later on, so let me tell you a little bit about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dog fighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a Lurcher-Staffy mix. She's a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most dogs, but you absolutely do not threaten her. She'll have you. So by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but far as my family are concerned, dogs go on camping trips. So when we all piled into the car, she came too. Unusually, though, none of the family friends could make it. So it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we'd left a bit later, although I don't remember why we'd left later than normal, we arrived at sunset. Not a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up and the beach illuminated in campfires. The beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car, while they sat pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year and I wanted her to have air. Always got to be looking out for my furry little homie. As we're fumbling about in the dark, on a beach. In the middle of nowhere, it's pretty spooky. The one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big zero shape if you felt like it. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, my mom's asking him had he seen that car drive round. It's been a few times. My dad kind of shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low, except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mom said it must be the security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down to do their nosy. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool. A junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches. Although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding onto the camping mallet, and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried to initially be a bit louky with the guy and told him that was fine. We'd leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us, so my dad started shouting and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad and possibly us as well, once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put Dad and her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down. A bolt from the black like a wolf descending on its prey took us all by surprise, most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator large canines represent in nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in the arm she had got him by. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. Quickly as we could, we gathered our things and all got back in the car, all pretty shook up by the incident. I looked Parmy over. She was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I'd left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her. As it was an old car and had the rolly-down windows and not an electric button, we think she must have been able to hit it with her paws to force it down enough to squeeze out. This is not the end of my story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided just to drive home so we could all feel safe, but first had to drive into the nearest town for petrol, as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a petrol station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to get a better look and stuck his head out the window to get a better look at the sign. My mom asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. Never. My heart ficking sank. Parked in the corner, behind a van so we hadn't seen him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was removed. The next town over was 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol, we realized, as we began driving. We were going to break down. That's fine, Dad said. We had AA cover. They'd come tow us home, or at least to somewhere acceptable for the night. Better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flash us from behind. Another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him, following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us, but we weren't really little kids. We were both double digits. We knew how dangerous this situation was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the man followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. Sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home, just grateful nothing worse had happened than that. After getting some sleep, my mom phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she spoke to said they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then? Other than a crazy man on the beach let's not meet. Well, for me, it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled as one of my mom's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home, she forgave but never forgot. I think the saying is, I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. They have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. If you're able to, please adopt. You might find yourself in a situation like mine one day. I promise you, if you're willing to save a four-legged friend's life, they will pay you back tenfold if they're able to, without a thought for their own safety. I paid £78 for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid. but it chills me to my bones knowing if I hadn't been so instant on a dog, I might be dead. Second story. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like, not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and hear something, open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular-looking dude just sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence and a guy that was probably high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then 2 days after that, and 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person. I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there is no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so stopped quickly after probably only 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over first thing in the morning, and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided sounded more like a human making animal calls, but could have actually been an animal. But I didn't actually see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. Third story. As a child, I would always camp out with the family. It has become a tradition. Every summer, we'd head down to this spot by the side of the highway. My uncle, whom I'll call Richard, owns the property there and had allowed to stay there for as long as we wanted, as long as we cleaned up afterwards. We had packed the usual things: a few tents, a cooler for the booze for the cooler, some stuff to grill over the campfire, a magnesium fire starter, hunting knife, and my stepdad's .44 revolver in case of coyotes. We live in Southwest Texas, so it isn't uncommon to run into them. Everything started off normal. Everyone was having a good time. The kids and myself, we all off having fun, skipping rocks across the river and fishing, unsuccessfully, while the adults were by the tents watching over us. Everything was nice, I guess. If only I knew that would change. The next morning started like the other ones while we were there. The adults were sluggishly moving around, hungover from drinking all night, while the kids and I slept. We would stay asleep until someone started to cook over the campfire. After we would wake up, the rest of the day would carry on. We'd walk around the area, but never too far. It's not that we weren't allowed to. We had always just feared going too far out into the woods without the adults. We'd always go to this clearing every time we went. It was like another camp clearing, except the fact that it was eerily darker than the surrounding area and had this atmosphere over it that would draw us in. We only left because we'd be called back to our camp, The sun set over the hills around us, and that signaled bedtime. The adults would make sure we got to our tents and then went back to the campfire to drink and laugh. Though they went to bed this night instead. I assumed they were just tired as well, with the nightly drinking and all. I couldn't fall asleep that night. I tossed and turned, eventually managing to shove my little brother off the air mattress in our tent. I decided I needed to relieve myself. So, I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went off into the woods. The walk to nature's restroom felt longer than usual. Must have been the dark, right? I had eventually found a spot that I thought would be okay to in and dumped off there. It's when nature's call had vanished that I noticed little lights moving in the trees. I, being the curious 15-year-old I was, followed them. After what felt like hours of staying off of paths and behind trees, we got to the clearing the kids and I had always gone to. The lights turned out to be men in hooded cloaks, the color of blood red, carrying torches into a triangle in the clearing. In the middle was a cross. Another hooded figure had stepped into the triangle and hung what looked like a person in a horse mask. I had managed to get a better look at what it was. These sick ficks had sewed on a horse's head onto someone. I wanted to puke. Why would someone do this? The hooded men started chanting. Another brought in a woman, whose eyes were covered by a blindfold and her hands and feet were bound by rope. They set her down in the triangle facing the cross. The man that had brought her in removed her blindfold. She looked up at the cross and let out the most blood-churning scream I had ever heard. The hooded men began chanting again, increasing in volume as the man in the triangle lifted his hands to reveal a blade. As he brought it into the air, the chanting stopped. He began to speak in some kind of unknown language. Latin, I assumed. The hooded man brought the blade to the woman's throat and stopped speaking. Then suddenly he shouted. To this day I still hear his words. May your tainted blood awaken thy sour soul. Upon shouting those words, he dragged the blade across her neck and removing her head from her body, holding her head up to the cross. The man-horse thing on the cross began to shake and thrash. Later, it began to scream. It was horrifying. It sounded so unnatural, like it wanted to scream out its own innards. Then, it looked at me. It wasn't like it just glanced at me. It full-on locked eyes with me. That's when I decided I've seen enough. I turned on my heels and ran. I ran faster than I thought I ever could. I got back to the camp and made sure I wasn't followed. Thankfully, I wasn't. I guess I was gone longer than it seemed, because the sun was starting to rise again. To this day, I still don't know what I saw, but I know I saw it. It still haunts me. Those gaping eyes locking with mine. I think that day I lost my soul through my eyes. I'll never know what happened, and I wish I hadn't seen it. Never. Am I going back there again?